Folks, I'd like to talk a little bit about four important sleep chemicals. Melatonin and adenosine, oxytocin, and nitric oxide. And as we mentioned, melatonin is a breakdown of an amino acid called tryptophan that's first metabolized into serotonin, which is a neurotransmitter, and then it's broken down further into melatonin. Now, here's some information about melatonin. It's a sleep accompanier. We're not saying that it automatically causes sleep, or whether it's an effective treatment for insomnia. It might be for some people, but we know that it goes along with sleep. In other words, it's from the pineal gland in the brain, and we know that it's released rhythmically with this daily or circadian rhythm. Peak levels in the evening, and higher levels of melatonin overall in the autumn and winter when nights are longer. Although if somebody lives near the equator, where there's no difference between day and I should say, day length really does not increase throughout or decrease throughout the year. There probably would be no difference between different seasons of the year. What does it do? Well, it's associated with courtship and reproduction. In other words, it's able to suppress some of the sex-related hormones, sex drive, like testosterone, estrogen. What else can we say? It's linked with human sleep. In other words, I want to mention that we sleep during the time it's released. We're not saying it causes sleep. It starts during the third or fourth months of life after birth and coincides with the consolidation of nighttime sleep. In other words, it's pretty solidly built into the individual's circadian pattern. By the time there's a full once daily sleep cycle, as we know, the sleep cycle changes throughout the life of an individual with multiple sleep bouts throughout, the day in an infant, and then maybe it'll change to twice a day. And then by the time somebody's a young adult or older child, then usually sleep once a day. Nighttime melatonin release peaks at about the age of 1 to 3 years and then declines slightly to a plateau that persists throughout early adulthood. 70-year-old individual decreased to 25% as compared with young adults. So if you're 25 years old, you probably produce a lot more melatonin than somebody who's in their 70s. Let's see, linked with jet lag as a treatment for jet lag. In other words, it can help to reset circadian rhythm. So if jet lag is a result of crossing many time zones, in a short period of time. So what it may do is it may help somebody kind of adjust to the new light dark cycle for the new time zone, right? If you're traveling from Europe to Asia or something like that. Melatonin taken as a treatment may help to kind of enhance the alignment of the new circadian rhythm in the person. And here's the optic chiasm, which is where the two optic nerves from each eye, the one from each eye, they cross over into at least partially to the opposite side of the brain. That's called the optic chiasm. And there's a part of the brain called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, the SCN, which is above that crossing place. Now, what happens there is that some of the nerve cells that are really responsible for vision kind of take a detour, and they provide input to the suprachiasmatic nucleus. And by doing so, during times of daylight, they're able to, suppress the release of melatonin from the pineal gland in the brain. But if, in other words, at nighttime, that suppression, that inhibitory influence from the suprachiasmatic nucleus to the pineal gland, that inhibition is greatly reduced, and therefore the pineal gland is free to release melatonin into the body to have the effects that we mentioned earlier. So that, that's it. We can say melatonin is released during hours of darkness. If you spend a lot of time in the dark, you have a lot of melatonin in your blood circulation and in your body in general, released primarily from the pineal gland. Whereas if you're in a very light situation, in other words, you're exposed to light and you're awake, well, you have melatonin suppressed, so you'll have relatively less melatonin. So that's melatonin. And let's move into some other chemicals here. As we know, there are two basic processes involved with sleep. One is circadian, at least this is a theory. The circadian process, which is a product of the rhythmicity of the light and dark cycle. And then the other process is a homeostatic process, which has more to do with the person's individual need for sleep. So those two systems, those two factors, the circadian factor that's called C, letter C, and then the homeostatic factor, which is called S for sleep, they interact to determine sleepiness, their desire for sleep. Another important brain chemical is called orexin, and it's a circadian one. In other words, it applies this to the circadian factor. It's associated with a number of processes: blood pressure, appetite, in addition to sleep. It was first actually was named as a result of its association with appetite and as a feeding stimulus. Discovered in 1998 and connected with blood pressure, as we said, appetite. So the name actually means eating. Orexin means feeding. So the idea, or it's linked to feeding. And so it in addition to its function, whatever it has as far as this sleep stimulus, it does have an interact with our feeding behavior, at least in animals. I don't know what the extent of the effect is in humans. The first studies with orexin, there's two kinds of receptors for orexin. There's two types of orexin A and B, which are peptides that consist of 33 and 28 amino acids. A peptide is a small protein that is made of amino acids. Injected into the rat brain led to increased feedings. And the source is in the hypothalamus of the brain, and in the linked close region to the hypothalamus. And it's linked to feeding, reward, and vigilance to ensure their availability. In other words, if you're a rat, for example, you're a mammal, you're a creature. I don't know if fish have orexin, how much they have. A creature has to be alert to the presence of food and other biological necessities. During stress, orexin may help a creature maintain wakefulness. In other words, it contributes to behaviors linked to vigilance. In other words, being aware of what's going on in the environment. So you have to be alert. If you're hungry, you're probably awake and alert. Let's see, what else can we say about orexin? It is a recognized, an orexin blocker is Supraxin, I believe it's called, is sometimes used as a treatment for insomnia, right? So in other words, somebody can't sleep, it maybe because they have an overactive orexin system, and therefore by blocking some of those receptors for orexin, it may reduce the arousal and the state of wakefulness and vigilance sufficiently to help somebody overcome the sleep problem, insomnia. Insomnia is a sleep disorder where people cannot sleep well. Maybe too much orexin, or maybe too sensitive to orexin they have. There's another condition called narcolepsy, right? Narcolepsy is the irresistible sudden urge to fall asleep. In other words, people that have narcolepsy they have a tendency to kind of nod off at unpredictable times, which of course can be dangerous. So the idea is that, there may be kind of a problem with the orexin system. I'm not sure exactly what the nature of that problem would be, but the idea is orexin seems to be linked somehow with the loss of smooth transitioning from wakefulness to sleep, so that somebody kind of falls asleep very rapidly and without warning. So that's orexin. When you think of orexin, recall that it's a circadian factor, and it's linked with awake, the waking state, being wakeful and alert. Another brain chemical is adenosine, which is a homeostatic sleep promoter. In other words, it's not so much linked to the circadian system as it is to the homeostatic system, which says that, basically, if somebody has a homeostatic sleep promoter, it means that it's linked to somebody's need for sleep, regardless of what the circadian factor may be telling the individual. Systemic means it's in the general blood circulation. Central administration would be in the central nervous system. Adenosine or adenosine A1 receptor agonist. An agonist is a chemical that acts like something else. All right. So if you put in if you're introducing adenosine as a chemical into the brain, then it can induce sleepiness and impaired vigilance by inhibiting the wake active neurons. In other words, the neurons that cause you to be awake and alert are kind of inhibited or kind of shut off by the presence of adenosine. Caffeine, which is an alkaloid found in coffee and other plants, is an antagonist. In other words, what that means is that what caffeine will do is kind of block the action of adenosine, which is a sleep promoter. So if you have caffeine, you have coffee, you may find yourself being maybe more alert than you would have been had you not had caffeine. Adenosine is produced, it's used all over the body. Adenosine triphosphate or ATP is the the source of energy in our body's cells. So in other words, when adenosine that's bonded with three phosphate group molecules, it's called ATP. The adenosine is the basis of that molecule. It's also there's one of the bases in our genes is called adenosine, or I should say adenine. Right? Adenine, along with cytosine and guanine and tyrosine, are the four bases in genes. And so adenine itself, which is part of the genetic molecule, combines with a sugar called ribose. It's called adenosine. Right. So adenine is formed in the body, and it's produced all over the body. It's used all over the body for energy, and for adenosine is used for energy. And the basic building block of adenosine is adenine, which is an important component of our genes. Adenosine levels increase with prolonged wakefulness in the basal forebrain of the brain. Right, I'll get you a picture of the basal forebrain. That's the basal forebrain. Right, so it's in the top of the brain, or kind of our thinking part of our brain. And that's one of the things that, in other words, whether it causes wakefulness or whether it's just kind of something that goes along with wakefulness, I don't know. But it's linked with, it's correlated with alertness or wakefulness in the basal forebrain area. Prolonged sleep deprivation, as we see here, upregulates A1 receptor mRNA, which means that if somebody's undergoing sleep regulation, like Randy Gardner, for example, he probably underwent an increase in the adenosine receptors in his brain to make him more sensitive to sleeping. In other words, make him more desirous of sleep. So in other words, there's at least two ways to increase the influence of adenosine. One is to actually increase the adenosine levels, by itself, or to increase the number of receptors for adenosine to make the person, or the rat, right, more sensitive to adenosine. Some adenosine is released from glial cells that are called astrocytes. Right, so you may recall glial cells are important for sending nerve impulses along the axon. They're not nerve cells, but they're in the brain, they're in the nervous system. Astrocytes are one type of glial cell that themselves are a source of adenosine. And adenosine, let's see. Okay, I wanted to mention another third, moving from adenosine. There's another chemical. This is the fourth of the four chemicals. Remember, we talked about orexin and melatonin and adenosine. Here's a fourth one called nitric oxide, which is linked with non-REM sleep, which are deep sleep. A gaseous molecule synthesized under basal conditions. In other words, as a rule, you're going to have nitric oxide being produced kind of on an ongoing manner. It's an inhibitory neuromodulator, which means that it's similar to a neurotransmitter, but it's not really a full neurotransmitter by itself, but it'll contribute to inhibitory or dampening effects on nerve cells. And the result of that is that it promotes deep sleep or non-REM sleep. Remember, you can basically break sleep down into two types. There's REM sleep, which is involved with rapid eye movements and usually dreaming. And then there's non-REM, NREM, right, which includes deep sleep. So you can say, gee, in general, there's two kinds of sleep. There's non-REM and there's REM. And so nitric oxide is involved not so much with REM sleep, but rather with the non-REM sleep. And let's see, now this is an interesting article. You can take a look at this, right? Look up the article if you'd like. I'd like to cite some of the concepts linked in the article. Nitric oxide stimulates release of adenosine, maybe. We know that in general, if you find nitric oxide, you're probably going to find, in other words, if that's increased in the brain, particularly in the basal forebrain region, then adenosine is probably also being produced. So they, in a sense, they kind of work together to promote sleep. And in this particular study, I'd just like to mention, if you look at the top trace here, you see that this is the baseline during wakefulness. Now, in the sense of this is like the during sleep deprivation. These are rodents, and changes in nitric oxide and adenosine. That'd be the top two pictures. The bottom would involve pyruvate and lactate. Don't worry about the bottom half of the diagram. But what you want to notice here is that the basal forebrain underwent an increase in nitric oxide release or presence to above the baseline non-sleep deprived level here, right? But the other parts of the brain that are not the brain, the basal forebrain, did not undergo an increase. And again, similarly with adenosine, look at what happens in the brain, the basal forebrain. Adenosine levels went up during a period of sleep deprivation. So nitric oxide and adenosine tend to increase as the rodent is kept awake beyond what it would usually remain awake. And other diagram, interesting diagram. Let's see. This is baseline. In other words, before sleep deprivation. So notice that as sleep deprivation continues, right? In other words, as the critters that would be sleeping are prevented from sleeping, we see that this would be adenosine over here on the top trace here, and the bottom picture or tracing would be nitric oxide. So notice that as sleep deprivation increases, as it continues, well, then you have an uptick or an increase in adenosine concentration in the basal forebrain. And you find a similar increase in nitric oxide in the basal forebrain, indicated by the dark colored bars. And then in recovery sleep, decreased during recovery sleep. In other words, when the little rodents were permitted, I don't know if they were rats or mice, but they were permitted to sleep, and they find that, well, geez, after sleeping, the level of adenosine and also the level of nitric oxide goes down to baseline. So the deal seems to be that stay up for a long time and you get more adenosine, probably in humans also. You get more adenosine building up in the forebrain, in your brain, as you stay up. The longer you stay up, go to sleep, and then it goes down. Same thing with nitric oxide. So that's that. There are a few comments about the role of different brain chemicals, including melatonin and orexin, nitric oxide, and adenosine for important sleep chemicals.